Japanese internment, and an end to the New Deal. So the biggest real clash in culture during World War II at home in America is actually going to be how America decides to handle Japanese Americans. On February 19th of 1942, FDR is going to authorize the Secretary of War to define, so to speak, restricted areas and remove civilian residents who were threats to national security. The primary target in this is 112,000 Japanese Americans who lived in parts of California, as well as Washington, Oregon, Arizona, mostly that West Coast, as well as their American-born children. The thing is, these immigrants had already dealt with hostility because of like racial prejudice and everything at this time, but now with World War II, we get anti-Japanese hysteria, and this basically gave officials an excuse to take action against what they saw as enemy aliens, or basically immigrants who had retained their Japanese citizenship, as well as their American-born children. Basically, these Japanese Americans would be given about a week at the end of April in 1942 to get all of your affairs in order, and then report to assembly centers. Now, keep in mind, affairs in order, this means if you owned a business, figure out what you're going to do with your business and everything and how you're going to pay for it when you're not there and not running it. And so there's a lot of loss of like economic life, but then also like social life, and that like children would have to give up pets and things like that as they came to these assembly centers. Now, they'd be housed there then for several weeks and then moved again to about 10 internment camps that were in isolated locations in the western interior. They'd be housed in these tar paper barracks and then hemmed in by barbed wire fences and guarded by military police. So basically treated as prisoners. Now, the reaction in the Japanese American community is going to be varied. Some would react with disgust and renounce their citizenship to America and everything, but others would really try to express their loyalty to America and like cooperate with authorities. And you even have like children, when they could, sign up to, go and fight in the war effort, for example. The Supreme Court is going to sanction these removals in the case of Korematsu versus United States in 1944. However, as much as it was sanctioned at the time, the United States is going to officially recognize the liability for lost property for these Japanese Americans with the Japanese Claims Act of 1948. It's not until 1988, though, that the United States is going to acknowledge the broader moral responsibility it had in this movement against Japanese Americans. And at that time, Congress will approve redress payments for each of the 60,000 surviving evacuees. The thing is, this could have been avoided, and we can say that as a definite fact because in some places it was avoided. For example, in Hawaii. The thing is, Hawaii, you could make the argument, was actually a greater threat to having some sort of like Japanese spy or anything there, considering its position in the United States. But because Hawaii had a history of being a multi-ethnic society, basically its residents were disinclined to look for some sort of racial scapegoat. You get fewer than 1% interred on the islands. This also contrasts a lot compared to like German Americans and Italian Americans, because if there was an actual threat and this wasn't just racism, then they should have been interred in very large numbers as well. But the reality was only about 11,000 German nationals and German Americans who were seen as individual threats were ever interred. And for Italian Americans, it was fewer than 2,000. And so that's very tiny fractions of the total population. So this is much different, and this shows the racism behind a lot of Americans' actions at this time. We're also going to see the end of the New Deal during this time period. Basically, the New Deal has run out of steam by about 1938, and at that point, FDR is really refocusing on foreign policy. Now, when we get the 1942 elections, we are going to see a majority of Republicans in Congress, which is also going to curtail a lot of the programs from the New Deal. When it gets to the presidential election of 1944, Republicans are going to put forward Thomas Dewey of New York, and Democrats are going to renominate FDR for a 4th term. You cannot do this anymore as President of the United States. You can only run for 2 terms, but FDR goes for a 4th term, and his vice president is running mate Senator Harry S. Truman, trying to appease the Southern Democrats. Basically, supporters behind FDR would argue that the nation couldn't afford to change leaders in the middle of a war. But it is going to show that, like, Dewey is very young, being the Republican candidate, and this kind of points out the president's failing health and failing energy. Still, as you can see on this map, FDR got 432 electoral votes to the 99 that Dewey got, but the popular vote is starting to narrow with a 54% to a 46%. When it comes to looking at America in World War II, though, we're going to see that there's this idea that the United States and Great Britain need to open a second front against Germany by attacking across the English Channel. But they want to be careful about this strategy, and they don't want to invade too soon. The reason they need to invade is A, to kind of free up France and maybe gain more troops that way, etc., but also because if you're looking on the Eastern Front, Stalin and the Russians, the Soviet Union, is being bogged down by German attacks. And so Stalin really needed a full-scale invasion on the western part of Europe to divert German forces from the Eastern Front. The thing is, by this point, Soviet troops were inflicting 90% of German battle casualties. We talk a lot of times about America coming in and winning the war and everything like that. When we see the numbers, the Soviet Union is one of the big contenders of taking out Germany, really. So we're going to see the United States has joined the war effort, but the Allies have to kind of hammer out their war aims and decide when they're going to invade, etc. They are going to decide that they're going to demand for an unconditional surrender of all 3 countries, and that no deal would be made to keep enemy governments or leaders in power. They really wanted to avoid the mistake they had made of ending World War I with Germany intact that same way. So in 1943, basically the United States and Great Britain promised to invade France within the next 6 months. But this relationship the United States has with Great Britain, and really more so the Soviet Union, has more of a superficial harmony than anything else, and it actually would barely survive the end of the war. And hopefully you know what comes after World War II is going to be the Cold War, which is really predominantly between the United States and the Soviet Union. So we have this harmony, but it's superficial at best. The Soviet Union really shoulders the brunt of the war for about 2.5 years before this American invasion and everything with D-Day. FDR has all these ideals about self-determination, but actually this seemed really naive to Churchill, who wanted major powers to carve out realistic spheres of influence in Europe, as well as the Soviet Union, and Stalin very much wanted to control much of Eastern Europe so they could protect the Soviet Union against future invasions.